Alexander v. United States considered the constitutionality of a criminal forfeiture statute when applied to assets protected by the First Amendment. Ferris Alexander was convicted under the Racketeer-Influenced Corrupt Organizations Act, also known as RICO. Congress designed RICO to combat organized crime by providing for the seizure and forfeiture of businesses associated with racketeering, even if those businesses were otherwise legitimate. To convict under RICO, the government must show that the defendant committed at least two underlying crimes that qualify as racketeering activities. The government must also show that the defendant was directly involved in a criminal enterprise. Defendants convicted under RICO are subject to prison, fines, and forfeiture. Alexander owned more than a dozen stores and theaters dealing in sexually explicit content. He was convicted of selling 7 obscene books and movies, which the First Amendment did not protect. The court sentenced him to fines and prison, and because the sales qualified as racketeering activities under the RICO statute, the district court also ordered Alexander to forfeit all of his wholesale and retail businesses. The forfeiture order included almost $9 million and all of his other business assets. This meant that books and other inventory that hadn't been adjudicated obscene were also confiscated. Alexander appealed, arguing that the forfeiture order was a prior restraint on speech in violation of the First Amendment because the order applied to non-obscene material. The Court of Appeals affirmed the district court's order. Alexander then petitioned the United States Supreme Court for review. The Supreme Court accepted the case to consider whether the forfeiture order violated Alexander's First Amendment right to free expression. Chief Justice Rehnquist, writing for the majority, concluded that the forfeiture order wasn't a prior restraint on speech and didn't violate the First Amendment. A prior restraint is an administrative or judicial order forbidding speech before the speech occurs. Traditionally, the First Amendment has provided greater protection from prior restraints than from subsequent punishments. In this case, Rehnquist reasoned that the forfeiture order didn't prohibit Alexander from expressing himself in the future. Alexander remained free to open another adult bookstore, but the forfeiture order meant Alexander couldn't finance his future expression with assets connected to his racketeering activity. The RICO statute wasn't concerned with whether the forfeited assets were expressive or not. The district court ordered forfeiture of Alexander's assets solely because the assets were directly related to his racketeering and not because of their content. Moreover, the court did so only after a full criminal jury trial with all applicable procedural safeguards. The jury had determined that Alexander violated the RICO statute by selling obscene materials, and the criminal punishment only came afterward. So there was no prior restraint on his speech and no First Amendment violation. The court affirmed the judgment of the Court of Appeals and remanded the case for consideration of Alexander's alternative argument under the Eighth Amendment. Justice Souter, concurring in part and dissenting in part, agreed with the majority that the forfeiture wasn't a prior restraint on speech. However, he also agreed with the dissent that the First Amendment prohibited forfeiture of expressive material that had not been adjudicated obscene. Justice Kennedy dissented, joined by Justices Blackmun and Stevens, and joined in part by Justice Souter. Kennedy argued that a forfeiture order was fundamentally different from a prison term or a fine. The majority's arbitrary line between prior restraints and subsequent punishments elevated form over function. Kennedy argued that the First Amendment analysis shouldn't be driven by how the government action is labeled, but instead by the government action's operation and effect on the suppression of speech. Kennedy explained that some government actions have characteristics of both prior restraints and punishments. In some circumstances, the operation and effect of a punishment, while not a traditional prior restraint, raises similar First Amendment concerns due to the chilling effect it has on protected speech. Here, the forfeiture of Alexander's assets functioned as both a punishment and a prior restraint. In the process of being punished for obscenity, Alexander was forced to forfeit materials that were not judged to be obscene. Thus, the forfeiture order interfered with expressive content without any prior judicial determination that the materials were obscene. For this reason, Kennedy concluded the forfeiture order closely resembled a prior restraint and therefore violated the First Amendment. Alexander v. United States was the first Supreme Court case to affirm the use of forfeiture in RICO prosecutions based on an underlying obscenity offense.